Welcome everybody to this December 2020 installment of the Northwest China Council's China Chat series. It's the final one for the year. I'm Joe Liston, the president of the Northwest China Council this year. Helping coordinate and produce this event tonight is John Wang, who I am eternally grateful for helping produce and getting everything going tonight. For those of you unfamiliar, you might all be, but there might be some people who aren't. The Northwest China Council is a Portland, Oregon-based educational nonprofit formed in 1980 to promote greater cultural understanding between the U.S. and China. We offer Mandarin Chinese lessons online, China chats, and soon other virtual events as well. And after the pandemic subsides, which hopefully is soon, we'll return to more of a mix of in-person and virtual events, hopefully. So to learn more about our organization and to keep track of events we sponsor and are involved with, visit us on the web at nwchina.org. There you can also find links to register for upcoming China chats and also view recordings of previous China chats, because we record these events and put them on our YouTube channel. Yeah, you can go back and look at those. Before I introduce tonight's guest, just want to let you know that there will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation tonight. If you would like to ask a question, please do so by entering it in the chat box. And at the end of Mr. Lawrence's presentation tonight, I will read them off to him and sort of moderate that discussion.
No,
so
please,
tonight,
Hugh. Mr. Lawrence was my father.
Okay. Hugh Lawrence is a trustee of the American Philatelic
Association.
Philatelic
Research Library. What am I talking about? Michael, I didn't mean to supplant you.
He studied Chinese stamps for over 40 years, and tonight we'll talk about the hyperinflation of stamps of 1948 to 49 China and how the hyperinflation led to the victory of the Chinese Communist Party, the flight of the Nationalists to Taiwan, and other historical outcomes. Thank you so much, Hugh. I'm going to turn this over to you, and reminder to everybody, if you have questions, just enter them in the chat and we will address them at the end of the presentation tonight.
Sounds good, John. Okay, this is the picture on the front, and due respect and credit to Henri Cartier-Bresson, who was a photographer back in the 40s, did a lot of work in China and elsewhere, did some phenomenal photography, passed away probably about 15 years ago, if I remember correctly. And this is one of his pictures of a line, I believe, approaching a bank in Shanghai, sometime probably in March, April, or May of 1949. Actually, you probably could find pictures that are not that terribly dissimilar if you wind up going to the US photo archives on the Great Depression. Different situation, but same sort of results. Why don't we pop to the next one now? And I'm going to basically say, I basically planned on becoming a professor of Chinese history. I did my undergraduate work. I then did graduate work. I was in graduate school for a year, went to Taiwan for a year at the Inter-University Chinese language facility there. That's actually where I met Wendy Larson. Hi, Wendy. I don't know if she can say anything or hear anything. But anywho, I decided then that I was trying to go back for the doctorate. I walked back. I sort of said, hi, guys, I'm ready. This was a couple of years later because I lived in Japan for a while. And then they said, well, that's great, but there's one problem. I said, oh, yeah, there was one job nationwide last year. I had no other source of support, so what does a derelict academic do? It's a little bit too late to go to medical school. I went into law. What I find interesting though is that I then spent roughly 7 years of my life learning my life's avocation. It's been fun. When I opted out of Chinese studies and academia, I decided to start collecting Chinese stamps. The PRC stamps had just become available in the US actually about a year or so earlier. This was 1975. And I went on from there first on liberated areas and then moving towards this gold yuan period. I've also joked that I collect everything in China as long as it was issued between 1948 and 1949. Hyperinflation. The Chinese hyperinflation probably was not the very largest that the world has ever seen. I think Hungary probably, at least in the last century and a half, 2 centuries, I think Hungary has the title on that. At the same point in time, though, most of these other ones, and I don't deprecate at all the suffering these guys went through, but at the same point in time, the Hungarian, the Yugoslavian, the Greek, the Zimbabwean, even very recently the Venezuelan one, are really very local in scope. The two that I think are the major ones in the 20th and 21st century and have had the largest impact actually down to the present were one, the Chinese inflation, and two, hyperinflation, and two, the German hyperinflation of the early 1920s. That one led, of course, to the rise of Hitler, the Third Reich, and a whole series of events that are still unfolding, hypernationalism in Europe and things like that. As for the Chinese one, the nationalist government may have had a way to avoid the worst of it. When they did shift to the gold yuan, I'll come back to this more later, they actually had the wherewithal to back their currency. They had sufficient gold, silver, and foreign currency to back the entire amount of gold yuan they initially issued. They didn't do that. And from that, certainly the inflation was not the sole reason. There were a lot of issues, and I'm going to come to some of those, for the hyperinflation and for the Chinese communist victory. But the hyperinflation was certainly part, and it was something that was remembered for a long time thereafter. John, if we could go to the next. Hyperinflation basically, well, inflation is basically a price rise. And it could either be caused by a supply shrinking, which means demand goes up. It could be caused by cost of goods rising, which means your suppliers are increasing the price simply to maintain it. And you have various and sundry other things also, a large overproduction of currency, increase in policies such as increases in military spending and the like. I sort of view hyperinflation as inflation on steroids, but there is a definition that was created sometime around 1956 and has been pretty well accepted, pretty well used by Philip Kagan, which basically said, if the rate of inflation is going up at 50% per month and continues at that rate, it's considered to have begun on the date the initial 50% threshold was crossed and continues until 1 full year after it drops down and remains at that lower rate. I'm using as a measure of inflation or hyperinflation simply because it is relatively ascertainable, and I collect stamps, so I'm using the domestic surface mail rate in China as the measure of inflation, and you'll see from some charts coming up that it goes on quite a wild ride. The rate largely picked up around, actually, November 19th, 1948, it crossed that when it rose from 5,000 to 15,000. And I would say it crossed that threshold sometime between July and then, when the $5,000 rate was initially achieved in July. It would then remain at that rate probably until about halfway through 1950. Let's go to the next quickly. John? Oh, thank you. The lead up, and just a very quick rundown. I mean, China's had a lot of troubles over the last 150, 175, 200 years. Just counting most of the stuff with regard to, at least initially with regard to the West, you had the Opium Wars. This was part of a triangle trade. Britain needed more cash to pay for tea and silk and spices, or not spices, but tea and silk. So they figured, well, we'll have India sell China opium, and in exchange, silver went back, which was in the control of the Brits in India. You have the various unequal treaties that may actually be, my apologies if I'm being un-PC, the earliest of the Me Too scenarios. Very different one, however, and no disrespect on any of that. You had the Taiping Rebellion. The thought was that the monarchy was not really doing enough to protect them. The Boxer Rebellion was actually initially triggered by or not triggered by, but it was utilized by the monarchy. The monarchy is overthrown in 1911. Xian, that's Yuan Shikai, tried to take over. The Northern Expedition, which was to get rid of the Northern warlords. And then there were a couple of there was a civil war between the Nationalists and the Communists, which then moved in, and probably what saved the Communists was the Japanese invaded, first Manchuria and then China. After World War II, the third Civil War started, and at this point you had a situation in which there was an awful lot of scrambling for power. Japan basically surrendered much faster than than any of the Chinese, the Nationalists, or the Communists would expected. If we could go to the next. Chinese nationalist currency picked up initially in 1940. Up until then, you had a silver dollar rate, which actually was based upon silver dollars, and the rates actually stayed really pretty stable, 3 cents to 6 cents for, again, the domestic postage rates. They as in the wartime, it went up, and it actually increased from about 8 cents to $2. After the war, and this is what we're really focusing on now, was the beginning of the inflation, not the hyperinflation. And you had a situation in which the rates rose pretty much as followed John, on the next one, please. On this chart. Now, it's interesting in the sense that, we went for a very long time, 1945 until 1947, before you had any appreciable rise at all. It went from 200 to 100, 20 to 100. You then picked up to 500, you went to 2,000, you went to 5,000, and here is that big jump, and I misspoke earlier, it wasn't 500, it was 5,000 to 15,000. That was the rate that happened about the time we wind up getting to what's called gold yuan. Now, I believe you actually started hyperinflation with that uptick on the far right-hand side. If we could go to the next slide, please. Actually, we have to jump that. The major thing here, no, actually go back one, I'm sorry. Oh no, forward one, I'm sorry. I'm not really used to Zoom. Oh no, back one. I need to get to there. That's perfect. This is just then generally the area where a lot of the battling was going on at that time. So in the 27 months beginning in October 1, we had that 2,500% raise. After the war ended in September, both sides very rapidly began scrambling to create a position. And at the front end, for the first year or two, certainly the case that the Nationalists were strong. But at the same point in time, the Communists did make a lot of gains. The Nationalists, however, were basically aided by a number of things. The Americans, for one, there was an agreement with the Japanese that all arms would be released to the Nationalists and not the Communists. Even the Soviet Union had entered into a treaty of friendship and alliance. And because Stalin was not all that terribly fond of Mao Zedong. And, by the time you get to the first year or two, you really would not have turned around and expected the Communists to win. The Nationalists were really in charge, although there were areas in which the Communists were moving nicely, very much also in the Northeast. Okay, now let's go to the next. Gold yuan, after we had jumped up to that 15,000 CNC, in the beginning of August, August 20, actually, excuse me, in August, the Nationalists decided to introduce a new currency. This was the gold yuan currency, and this is the one which really bore the brunt of the hyperinflation. At the very beginning, it was accompanied, the exchange rate between CNC, Chinese national currency, also known as guobi or fabi, and gold yuan was $3 million CNC to $1 gold. Really quite a revaluation downward. And as I said, they could have backed it, but they didn't. Now, the rates were in part focused on or enforced by government action, price controls, prohibitions on hoarding, a prohibition on holding gold, silver, or foreign currency, and demands that those be turned over. And so that held for a little while. By October, however, and that was the time when the first gold yuan stamps began to come out, it was already beginning to slip. Now, by the way, the rest of this hyperinflation really is taking place, not the tail end at the end, but is taking place between October of 1949 and I would say late May, early June of 1949. I'm 48 and going to 1949. And the equivalent down at the bottom of that page is a $15,000 on 30-cent Chinese national currency stamp. And the half cent, which is also on a $500 CNC stamp, is the postage equivalent of the two. So it was quite a drop down. Next, please. John? Okay. The early uses. In the first month or so that gold yuan stamps were being issued, and actually at that point they hadn't even been turned around and the rates were not posted in gold yuan. They were only posted in CNC and you did conversions. Well, the only stamps that had been issued were two half-cent stamps, a 1 cent, a 2 cent, a 3 cent, a 4 cent, and a 5 cent. And a large amount of the CNC stamps were swirling around at that time. So you wind up getting covers like the two on the ends, where one of the stamps on the left-hand side cover is a gold yuan stamp, a half cent. The rest of it being a CNC, 5 CNC stamps, paying a goodly chunk of that value. That's actually the earliest cover I have of gold yuan. They were initially issued on October 9, excuse me. The one on the far right is actually a very interesting cover, and you were talking, well, about value and things like that. One of the places where used stamps acquire value is when you look to what the rates were going on. Now, I'm only talking really on the charts about the domestic surface rate, but there are actually, the whole panoply. You have domestic airmail, you have domestic international not domestic. You have international surface, you have international airmail, and all the services, registry, express, etc. Well, this cover right here on the right, is a registered domestic airmail cover. And it has a gold yuan value of $1.50. The reason for that is that the airmail surcharge went from 40 cents to $1 on November 18. The ordinary rate, the surface rate, went from half cent to 10 cent on the 19th. So this actually is a rate that existed for exactly 1 day. And what's amazing is the communications and were such that these rates were sent around. People knew them. And the surprising thing is the very large number of covers that one sees that have accurate rates, especially in this rapid transition. The one in the middle is actually the 5 cent, the 2 cent, and the 3 cent being used to pay an international surface rate, this time to South Africa. But the point is, you rarely see those stamps on cover. For some reason, they hadn't been distributed quite as widely as they could have been, although this was in Shanghai. And most of the stuff was emerging from there. If we go to the next. A lot of what triggered the inflation was obviously in one would expect, what was going on in the broader context of the war. And we're now going into into 1949 and the beginning of that really hyperbolic increase. On November 10, the communists launched what became known as the Huaihai campaign. It was a campaign in northern Jiangsu province, and the town of Suzhou was sort of the center of it. And this was a very major battle in the context of the Chinese Third Civil War, in the sense that that particular area was considered and had been for long history. Once an army could get through there, basically the rest of China lay open before it. And from November 6th through January 10th, that battle lasted. And with the end of that battle, pretty much the end was known. There was an interesting stamp that was issued by the communists in April of 1949 in the wake of that battle, which celebrated its victory, the victory of the Huaihai campaign. And among other things, it showed a large number of communist soldiers standing on a tank. And I think with a little bit of schadenfreude, if you look very carefully on the front of the tank were the letters USA, because that's who ultimately had supplied them, although not intentionally. If we go to the next. Now, as the nationalist fortunes really began waning in the early part of late 1948, early 1949, the inflation began to pick up. Now, when we're going to see in a second what the chart, but at the same point in time, things were going a little bit faster than the communists had intended. Number one is a cover that I'm showing on the left, and frankly, it looks sort of ugly. And for a long time, I thought, why did I buy this? Well, what came out is this cover was basically mailed on December 2nd, and it has $164 franking to cover the international airmail register rate. The key point to recognize, though, was that the $10 and $5 stamps, the green and the yellow, at that point in time were the highest value stamps China had issued, period. Even on the CNC, the largest CNC was $5 million, which actually was a paltry $1.67. So what can one say? They also sometimes didn't really have their act together, because the cover on the right shows shows a block of 10 half-cent stamps, but this was issued on November 27th, these stamps. The cover is used a little bit later in early December. And the point was that on November 19th, the basic rate went to 10 cents. Effectively, no one was using half-cent stamps at that time. And so you have the interesting situation for stamp collectors where the mint stamp is worth, I don't know, in the old days when the lowest value was 3 cents, this would have been 3 cents or maybe 2. Used stamps, however, are really quite hard, and actually in period uses, meaning uses at or about the time the stamp was issued, are actually very rare. If we could jump to the next. The next major set of campaigns, and I'm ignoring large areas. I mean, all sorts of things were going on in Manchuria before this, and even now, the communists had very much consolidated their position in northeast China. But now, having done that, and the Huaihai battle being in the past, communist forces in North China began to focus on Tianjin, which was the Jin of Pingjin, and Beiping. They initially approached the garrison in Tianjin and said, will you surrender? The Nationalists repeatedly said no. So finally, on January 21, I'm sorry, on January 14, the communist forces began an assault. It took 29 hours and the city was captured. There were numerous, as I said here, nationalist troops killed or captured. It was one of those cases, though, almost like the old so-called neutron bomb. Most of the city stayed intact. Now, once they got Tianjin, the communist armies moved towards Beiping. And at that point, they basically told the commander of that garrison, Fu Zhou, what would you like to do? And in the end, he entered into negotiations and the peaceful surrender of the city, relatively peaceful surrender of the city, on January 30th. Normally speaking, the communists were not that terribly happy to have nationalist stamps used after they took an area. But at the same point in time, there were logistical problems and things like that. So in many instances, they did not flat out bar it. In Beiping, that was allowed from the fall of the city on January 30th through about February 9th. In any of these cases, and it's a different situation when you get much later in the war into the Southwest, because there the war was decided. They weren't worrying about the stamps themselves acting as, in essence, signs. Hey, there's a new sheriff in town. But this is a cover that was sent from Beiping on, I believe it was February 2nd. And it went out. It was an international cover. Beiping, by the way, as I mentioned earlier, is, became Beijing again, having been Beijing prior to 1928 on October 1st. The next, if we could. Okay, this one I want to give you a little time just to read the text that's on the type text that's on the right. Now, I am going to apologize, but this is actually an air letter sheet that was mailed from Beiping on January 28th. It was still under the control of the Nationalists, and it went out by air. The airport was still in their hands. And the situation here was that this basically none is giving it some descriptions of the town and what was happening. And so we have a situation in which she is saying, hey, the army's still in the city. The Red Army is awaiting orders to come in. Prices are soaring 3 times daily, sometimes. She's hoping they don't plan to starve. It's a very difficult time. They had rice and cabbage only on Christmas. And I don't believe the dogs that are referred to in the end are hot dogs. So that was what was happening in the city itself in the last 2 days before the communists came in. But that, again, the entry was relatively peaceful. If you look at the rest of it, there is some talk about bombs and shelling going on in other areas, but it's relatively little. And neither the communists nor the nationalists really wanted to destroy Beiping. I mean, that had been historical. The communists had already decided that's where they wanted their government to be. There was a lot of issues in not destroying it. If we could go to the next, please. Did we miss a major chart? Yeah, could we go back to number 9, please? No, what am I saying? We'll see what happens in a second. I'm sorry, as I said, I'm not really used to this. Okay, let's go to the fall of Nanjing. No, this can't be. Could we go back a couple just to see what happened? Slowly. One more. One more. Nope, my fault. If we go forward to where we were, my apologies. Up about 3. Past this one. past this one, and now we're going to the fall of Nanjing. In essence, we're now moving into February. Beiping has fallen, Tianjin has fallen, Suzhou has fallen, and the communists are active throughout northern Jiangsu province, much of Anhui province north of the Yangtze River. And in fact, with the fall of, with the defeat in the Suzhou campaign, the Nationalists basically retreated south of the river. Now, once again, none of this currency is being backed. The rates are going up from $3 to $100, and then on April 17th, $100 to $1,500. Bottom line, everyone is looking forward to what's going to happen. And when the nationalist government falls, or at least in that area falls, there is no value left in the currency. So they want to get rid of it. And I'm certain in many areas, the prices, other than for quote unquote postage, are going up a lot faster. On April 17th, the $1,500 increase came. Between April 21st and 22nd, the communist forces crossed the Yangtze. The next day, they take Nanjing. Well, hold it. Now we've lost Beiping, Tianjin, the Huaihai campaign, and what was up until then the capital of China. This is not looking good. And the communists now turn towards Shanghai. And in the process, they took Hangzhou, which is just sort of on the way, but a little bit south in Zhejiang province. If we can jump to the next one. Okay, that's what I did here. Okay. Now, the final days of the gold yuan currency, we've already gotten to 1,500. Well, they decided that what they would do is they would prepare everything by issuing a new currency. You know, we can just declare everything is fine, which in essence is what they did. They issued silver yuan currency. Now, gold yuan currency continued to be usable. However, there was an exchange rate, just like there had been with CNC to gold yuan in October and in August. Well, now the rates were, and this is the difference. Number one, they weren't the same uniform throughout the country. In some areas, they went at one rate, other areas another. I've used the Shanghai rates simply because that was one of the few areas that was coming out of a centralized command, the Director General Posts, to go through this period, and we can track that, and we can track that on the cards and letters and the covers that were issued. And the rates then made a rapid increase. Now, the last increase was April 17th. We've now moved to April 27th, and the first silver yuan comes out. The exchange rate is 1,000,000 to 1. On May 2nd, a grand total of 5 days later, 4,000,000 to 1. That's really very stable. It stays that way until May 20th, 8,000,000 to 1. 2 days, basically over a weekend, it went to 12,000,000 to 1. And 2 days later, it went to 30,000,000 to 1. In essence, you were dealing with waste paper. There was no value left. And as I mentioned, I mean, what was backing the currency was the full faith and credit of the nationalist government. And at that point in time, it didn't have any. If we can go to the next. This is a little bit of eye candy, and it shows what was happening. All those stamps on the cover on the left, the surface rate was only 4 cents. This was the domestic airmail rate, 10 cents. At that point, it should have been $100,000. It's underpaid. There are $91,000 stamps shingled, most of them on the back cover. The one to the right was international surface registered mail rate. That wound up being 30 cents. It took $300,000 to pay it. These are $5,000 stamps. That looks pretty mellow. until you realize there is a sheet of 20 and a sheet of 10 behind it. All, by the way, canceled. The next, please. Beginning in April, we wound up getting some wonderful things called $100,000 stamps and more. A fairly common one, type of cover at this point, although this was a little bit unusual in the sense that it paid the international airmail rate, and it was an overweight cover, 20 grams. Normally, the airmail surcharges were for 10 grams. And you got 28 copies, 4 in the front, of a $100,000 stamp to pay it. This would have been probably somewhere around 16 cents in November. The next one actually goes later than the Shanghai gold yuan, and now you're going into these cities and towns that basically set their own. But the rate on the next one is there are 21. No, not 20. 28 $500,000 stamps. That was the third highest denomination stamp. The two above it were only issued in one town, which fell shortly after the 2 million and 5 million were issued. But there are covers that are, frank, with humongous numbers of those. And in fact, I've seen a cover from Hong Kong, actually to the patent office in the US, that is, frank, with 2 sheets of $500,000 stamp. That's 200 $500,000 stamps. Next, please. No, I do not own it. The last of the eye candy I want to show is here. This one on the right simply is another high value. It was from Sichuan province. And what you've got here is a, 20 each of a $200,000 stamp and a $500,000 stamp. And on the other side, there's a there's a $500,000 stamp. And again, these are all sort of empirically determined rates. The one on the left is Shanghai, and that went to a Mr. H.H. Kung, who some of you may know was a finance minister back in the 1930s. In fact, he actually met with Hitler seeking to obtain aid in their opposition to Japan. Now, this one is a actually a very scarce usage, not because of Mr. Kung, but because it's a mix between the gold yuan and the silver yuan. The 12 stamps on either side, the brown ones, are in the amount of $120,000. The difficulty is it underpaid the rate because by the time of May 24th, the rate had gone up from 12 million to 1 at the day before to 30 million to 1. So it's actually an underpayment. The 3 stamps in the middle are 60 cents, but they're silver yuan, and they covered the rest. Could we jump to the next? You know, we missed one, and I'm trying to figure out where the heck it was. I'm sorry. John, could we go back just a little bit? I'll try to bring this to a quick close. But if we can go back one at a time, I'm looking for one that has a chart that just goes off the top on the right-hand side. Keep going, please. One more. One more. One more. That's it. God, I didn't even, my apologies. This was, I want the chart if we could. It's one more forward. Yeah, this one, by the way, and please realize this is a logarithmic chart. The rates we're going for we're starting out at the very bottom. That is 1/2 cent. The top is $1.2 million. And a significant portion of that comes basically in the period from April 21 through May 21st. That may not be the worst, or actually May 24th. That may not be the worst inflation. It's not. it was exceeded by Hungary. But for a country that as large as China, that was something else. I'm sorry, now if we could go all the way back. I'm sorry, that was what I was looking for all this way. My apologies. If we go forward quite a ways to silver yuan. One more. Bingo, we're right here. Now, it's sort of interesting because with the advent of silver yuan, which of course was also not backed by anything, if you look at the catalogs, if you look at the stamps, if you look at the covers, I've had a lot of people tell me, well, gee, it seems like they just, they were able to bring the inflation to an end. Well, number one, the rates really didn't go up very much. They went from 4 cents to 5 cents, and then they went up to a whole 10 cents, and that was almost a year later. The point was that paper currency had become irrelevant. It was a barter economy. And if we can go to the next, I want to point out something in the letter that I show there, which is, and I'm pointing in specific, rice, gold, metal, and silver dollars have come out of hoarding and are the means of exchange. We trade checks for gold metal, we buy rice, prices are quoted in rice. He gives a couple of examples and he says, a letter to the United States costs nearly 2 pounds of rice. Such a medium of exchange is bulky and awkward. I would think so. There was no end. Currency just became irrelevant. If we could jump to the next, I'm almost to the point where I have 7:45. The ongoing impact. I was in Taiwan at the Inter-University Center in 1971-72. At that point in time, the highest denomination paper currency that was in circulation was 100 kwai, $100 new Taiwan dollars. That was $2.50 US. You went around with large bundles of cash. I know when I wound up paying my rent, I would walk in with $50, which was, it was only 200 individual pieces of paper currency, but it was a sort of a wad. The thing here is that I believe that the impact on the nationalist Chinese was such that the nationalist government on Taiwan was not, and when I say nationalist Chinese, I'm also saying those who were on Taiwan previously and had lived through the Japanese, the Taiwanese and anyone else who was there. I think that was the impact on that was so great, the hyperinflation, that the Taiwanese did not want, the nationalist government did not want to take the risk of getting people scared of it. And so, on the postage, yeah, we finally did go up to $2 in 1975. Wow. And now to the last slide, if we can. The PRC was not entirely exempt from this. Now, there were two different currencies that were in use. There was the people's currency, the original old people's currency, which lasted until 1955 and started out at $50 and went to $1,000 in March of 1950 and then dropped back in May to 800. In 1955, there was a 10,000 to 1 revaluation, not a devaluation, a revaluation. And that took the $800 to 8 cents. In 1990, and actually for a short time thereafter, the postage rate was still 8 cents for domestic mail. Now, the PRC probably had a much better ability to control. They had a much more centralized, planned economy, but Taiwan was under martial law for much of that period until 1975 at least. And so both were pretty well controlled, and they did not want this genie to reemerge. That is about all I have. I know I've been trying to go back and forth on both stamps and history and the like, and I hope it's been interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting, and we have some questions coming in. It looks like the QA function is available, so you can send in questions via chat or QA. Let me turn my camera back on so you can see me. You can send questions in either one of those two ways, and let's get started. Looks like we have a question from Michael Bloom. During the final days of the gold yuan currency, when exchange rates varied throughout the country, did people travel over regional boundaries to try to take advantage of currency trading?
Now, hold on, I'm only seeing, oh, let me get to the next. Could you repeat that one time, please?
Yeah, I can just read it to you. That way you don't have to track it down.
That would be good, please. One more time, if you'd be so kind.
Oh, no problem. This is from Michael Bloom. During the final days of the gold yuan currency, when exchange rates varied throughout the country, did people travel over regional boundaries to try to take advantage of currency trading?
There's an argument that some have this happen later in the Silver Yuan period, but the time when traveling to do this occurred was mostly during the 1920s, when you had differing rates in Xinjiang out west and other provinces. There was so little value left that the cost of traveling would have eaten up any possible profit. I think the answer is no.
Question from Wendy Larson. Hi, Hugh. Could you talk a bit about how you collect these stamps and covers and whether it is a popular period to collect among PRC philatelists?
Among PRC philatelists, arguably no, for the simple reason that the liberated areas are the comparable period that would be collected by PRC collectors. I had created an East China exhibit that I think, it developed over probably 25, 30 years. And I had reached the point where the only way I could continue to develop it would have been to either sell the wife or sell the house. And the wife was opposed to both of those. Fortunately, she's put up with the philatelist. That's amazing. But the point is that what I did initially, and it's very simple, I got into gold yuan stamps because they were cheap. And I would go to shows and I would go to dealers who had, very often they had collections they had bought and they had these albums. And I would go to them and say, look, I'm interested in the used stamps. And I would go through and say, look, you give me a price, hopefully somewhere between 1 and 4 cents. I will take every one of your used gold yuan stamps. And I will exclude the 2 sets that are actually quite high priced. I wasn't trying to do that. And I will take every last one of them. And I did that. And then at that point, covers were still relatively inexpensive. I could wind up buying most covers for like anywhere from $4 to $15. And when I finally got done doing that, and then I bought a number of collections myself that have been formed by other collectors, I had this large grouping. Now, my rate study, which goes over this exact period, and if you use the international and domestic air and surface, you wind up getting about 77 different rate periods. And it becomes quite a large event. It actually takes up 160 pages. And that is really what I did. And now I'm trying to turn around and do a little bit more because there's really very little information on the exact dates when many of these things were issued. And some of the stamps, I showed the half cent on 30-cent orange way back when. The point is that stamp is really a common stamp, man. It's not even that rare used, but most of the usages tend to wind up being a single stamp on a cover that has $500 worth of postage on it. A half cent and $500? No, it was just thrown there for philatelic purposes. And others, and a couple of them, I have most of the stamps on cover, including the high value ones. And I've also found that when I go through the used stamps, all of a sudden, I've got a stamp that I have maybe 2 used copies of. And then I wind up finding that it was issued either at a way after it was used or it was issued in a remote area. There are also a couple of expensive stamps that simply resulted because someone overprinted another sheet of stamps that looked like the first one. So a lot of the collecting of this stuff, I mean, if you want to get really specialized, which I don't, you have umpteen paper types, you have umpteen perforations, all these things that make true philatelists really, their mouths water. In my case, I'm more interested in the history because, as I said, I'm a derelict academic. I like the history. And this is my vehicle to still do it. And, oh, Wendy, I still, amazingly enough, it's not all that good, but I still read Chinese, and it's only been 50 years.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good. I can read a little bit. I'm probably at a preschool level. My Chinese professors would probably not be happy with my levels. But we have a question from Willow. Chinese stamps from what period of time are valued the most? What about stamps from the Cultural Revolution time?
The stamps from the Cultural Revolution time are valued. However, many of them, unless they happen to be the errors or the withdrawn, are available. I could probably go out tomorrow with a large enough wallet and buy every one, with the possible exception of the two whole country you read and the message to the Japanese workers. The Imperial have gone up and down, but there are some very good ones there. Obviously, the red revenues, but even they were now beginning to come back up again in value. When I sold my East China, I was very, very lucky. It was a very hot period for that. I didn't realize it at the time until afterwards. Liberated areas tend to be fairly good, but you really should know what you're doing only by virtue of the fact that at this point, there are a large number of forgeries. Way back when, what I was doing was I was actually tracking some of these stamps back to, in auction catalogs, to collections that existed 20 years before and things like that. And frankly, if it was 20 years before I was collecting in 1975, the likelihood of a forgery of the liberated area stuff was really very low. No one gave a damn. Obviously, there are various and sundry areas. Covers are good. I mean, anytime you have a copy of number 6, which is the 5-cent second printing, 5 Canada and second printing large dragon, especially mint, be very happy. It would far surpass the monkey. The Cultural Revolution is good. A lot of the stuff post 1980, 85 is questionable. Some of the stuff back from the 1950s into the 1960s and 70s, aside from Cultural Revolution, is actually regaining some of its value again.
Interesting. Okay. Are there any other questions?
This is Michael. I'd just like to say thank you so much for doing this presentation.
Looks like we have one from Jeffrey. I'm sorry to interrupt you. From Jeffrey. Let me see if I can pull this up and see. Jeffrey Wang. Wait, let me see if I can pull up my participants here. He's had his hand up for a while. Jeffrey Lang, I'm sorry. Did you have a question? Let's unmute him, John, if possible. Or
I didn't have a question. Yeah.
You didn't have a question? No? Okay.
I didn't submit a question.
Oh, okay. Your hand was up in the chat, so we just wanted to make sure we got you in case you did. Looks like we have another question from Willow. Do people here exchange or sell Chinese stamps?
Oh, yeah. I don't know so much about exchanging, but I've certainly traded with people. There are U.S. auction houses. With everything that's been happening of late, the Hong Kong auction houses have sort of slowed their work, but at the same point in time, you still have Hong Kong auctions going, and most of those are done by by web. You still have Beijing auctions going. You have dealers. Michael mentioned Steve Frumkin, who is a local dealer up there in Salem. No, what am I saying? In Portland, Beaverton. And he has been very active. I first met Steve when he was down in Santa Monica in the 1970s working with George Alavizos. And he's been a very long time, very knowledgeable dealer, specializing in Chinese material and to an extent other East Asian material.
And following up on that last question, Wendy Larson asks, if people in the PRC do not collect this period of stamps and covers, who does? Are they popular in Taiwan and Hong Kong?
I'm sorry, I misinterpreted Wendy's question. I was looking at it as the question of do PRC, I interpreted PRC collectors as those who collect PRC stamps. No, all of this stuff is collected elsewhere, is collected throughout China. I recently acquired, and for anyone who knows the catalog, there is one of the stamps is a 10-cent on $1 stamp that happened to be printed on a different printer's basic stamp, and it catalogs for about $275 a copy. And mint is actually used as a little more expensive. And I went for a cover that had 7 of those on, paying a correct rate at the correct time. And I got it. But there was someone out of Qingdao who drove me to the absolute top of my, what I thought, insanely high bid. We won't go into any more details than that. But no, yes, there are people who collect this stuff. The other point is that, yes, on a lot of liberated area stuff right now, unless you are exceedingly wealthy, you can't get the best level stuff. It's gone stratospheric. Even now, it has not really cheapened. So yes, no, a lot of the classical material, the imperial, the early republic, the gold yuan period is actually popular. Silver yuan, if anything, more popular. But silver yuan is also much rarer, so you wind up bringing, the paycheck, not the paycheck, the checkbook more into the issue.
Okay, so we have
Let me make one comment.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No worries. You had mentioned about the studying Chinese. I just wanted to mention and maybe begin to sort of bring this to an end with what I hope is just going to create a smile. When I was studying Chinese, I was very lucky. There were only 2 of us in the class. It was at a university. It was a required course for me. They couldn't cancel the course. And one day I was talking, and the class was at this point was being conducted entirely in Chinese. And I said something. And the professor looked at me and smiled and said, "Mr. Lawrence, I can't really say that what you said was wrong. And there are 700 million Chinese." This was a while ago. 1 or 2 probably would have said it like that.
That's funny. We do have a couple more questions. Do you have a minute or two?
If I haven't put everyone to sleep, I'm more than happy to try. I can't guarantee I can provide any wisdom, and that comment about me being an expert's a different issue. But I'll try for as long as you care to.
Yeah, we have a couple more questions, and then we'll finish off with a couple of people had some kind comments about the presentation tonight. But we'll start with Jeffrey Lang. Does the current Chinese government frown on the collectors who make a lot of money from the appreciation of stamps?
As long as they have not crossed Xi Jinping, more likely than not, no. The point was that for a significant period of time, and Wendy is probably aware of this, for the average Chinese, stamps were an investment. I mean, it was something they could wind up investing in without having to worry about stock markets or things like that. And they could also do it vest pocket, meaning largely off the record. And in that, I'm not putting down Chinese. The same thing is done here all the time.
And then the final question, and then I'll read a couple of comments to you. Oh, they're good. They're good. No worries. No worries. Make one see.
I'm teasing.
Okay, so this one comes from Willow. She asks, should the stamps be removed off the envelopes, or do you keep the stamps on the envelopes?
I can't begin to describe the amount. Now, every stamp, no. It's sort of like if you have an 8-fun stamp of which there were 500 million made, or with some of the 3-cent stamps that were printed here in the billions back in the 1940s and 50s. If you take it off the cover, fine and dandy. But if there's anything unusual, I would keep it on the cover for the simple reason that, let's just suffice it to say that $275 stamp that I bought on cover was substantially more than $275. And I'm not certain I would have had to pay $275, even though that was the catalog, if it was off cover. So anything that is unusual, scarce, or if you're trying to show, a rate study, you need to look at them on the cover. But then again, that's called postal history, and some people collect it and some people refuse to.
Alexia Stefan wanted Willow to know that we have a very nice stamp show, Pipex, in Portland, that draw dealers from all over the country. So Willow, take a note of that. And then finally, Joanne Wakeland says, this is a great presentation. Thank you. It really showed the hyperinflation. I was at the Stanford Center in Taiwan 2 years before you were. It was a fascinating time. Somehow I didn't remember the money though. Thank you.
Well, I was there in 71, 72, and Wendy was there beginning in 71, 72. And oh my God, Wendy, I'm sorry. Did I disclose the wrong thing? By the way, if you feel like it, send me an email.
Yeah. He's laughing, so that's a good thing. All right.
No,
well,
that's where I met Wendy.
Ah, it's interesting. Well, thank you so much, Hugh. This has been an interesting discussion, interesting presentation tonight.
I thank you very much for the opportunity, and it was fun. You're also getting the first crack at presenting it, and over time it may get a little smoother.
And thank you everybody who attended this evening. It's nice to have you. Keep your eyes open for more China Chats coming up, and then also take a look for this talk. John will post it on our YouTube channel coming up pretty soon. So once again, thank you all, and have a great evening.
And thank you all. Take care, guys.
Thanks. Good night.